Good day, everyone. I'd like to thank each of you for your time today, and welcome to the final session of our 5-part series. I'm David Testerman with BrokerHunter.com, and I'll be your moderator for today's final presentation. Today is, as I indicated, is the final session of the Xtreme Success webinar series. Today's session, Session 5, is the Xtreme Success Record. As we have in the past, we will be having Q&A, so please make sure to ask any questions via the chat pane, and we'll get to these at the end of the formal presentation. Some quick housekeeping here. If anybody's having any trouble or anything, please see the technical support numbers right here. And with the housekeeping complete, I'm going to tell those of you that are joining us today new a little bit about our speaker today, Mr. Peter Weddle. Peter has authored and edited over 24 books, and he's been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, the National Business Employment Weekly, and CNN. He's actually been described by the Washington Post as a man filled with ingenious ideas. Peter's also the CEO of Weddle's Research and Publishing, which specializes in employment and workforce issues, and he's also the managing director of the International Association of Employment Websites, which is the trade organization for the global online employment services industry. Peter is a graduate of West Point, and he holds advanced degrees from Middlebury College and Harvard University. So when it comes to employment-related issues and a host of other topics, Peter certainly knows what he's talking about. And with the introduction complete, it is my pleasure to introduce everyone to Mr. Peter Weddle. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, David, and let me add my welcome to all of you for joining us today. As you can see from the title slide, and as David has mentioned, we're going to talk about career records. And I know that talking about career-related documents, and especially a resume, is about the closest thing you could get to watching paint dry. But in this challenging workplace, and this challenging job market that we are finding ourselves in these days, these documents can spell the difference between success and failure. So I think it's important that we conclude our 5-part series by looking at just what we have to do by way of documentation in order to reinforce the success that we've achieved with the other 4 sessions. So let's begin with a review. And for those of you who've been with us for all 4 of the previous sessions, this will be a little bit repetitive, but I think it's important to just make sure we understand the environment that we're in. For most of the past 30 years, for the entire careers of almost everybody listening today, the employers for which we work have been competing with cheaper labor. They've been competing with organizations around the world in the global marketplace that had labor that was less expensive than labor in the States. But today that's not the dynamic. Today the dynamic isn't cheaper labor, it's smarter labor. Today employers are competing with organizations that have employees with more up-to-date skills, more up-to-date knowledge than many organizations in the States. And that has changed the definition of qualified in the job market. It means that what we have to do to be perceived as a qualified applicant has now changed in the job market. In the same way, the workplace has changed as well. For most of the past 30 years, the pace at which knowledge and skills advanced was relatively slow. Today it's not. Today knowledge and skills are changing at warp speed. And as a result, there's been a change in the way employees are valued in the workplace. It's a different challenge to be perceived as a qualified and valued employee in today's workplace. So change is the new norm. Change is frenetic. Change is profound. And a lot of people have decided that the best way to proceed in this environment is to just hunker down and hang on. But I believe that's wrong. I believe the question for each of us shouldn't be how do we survive in this new marketplace and this new job market. It should be how do we prosper. So what I want to talk about today is extreme success. Extreme success is a new way of working a way of working that enables you to be proactive rather than reactive in this highly turbulent new environment. It's a way of working that enables you to be the captain of your career rather than the victim of your career. It is the way to give your career the strength, the reach, and the endurance that you need to be the best you can be in the 1/3 of your life you're going to spend at work. The first part of the extreme success methodology is understanding the dynamics of this new extreme job market and extreme workplace. These changes, as I just indicated, are permanent and they are profound, and we covered those changes in session 1. In order to begin to build extreme success in the face of all of this change, we have to begin seeing ourselves differently. And we talked about that in session number 2. We want to reset ourselves as an asset in the job market and in the workplace by first in the job market to stop seeing ourselves as a job seeker, to stop seeing ourselves as a supplicant for work. And in the workplace, to stop seeing ourselves as a human resource, to stop seeing ourselves as just one of the herd coming to work each day. How do you do that? You reimagine yourself. You see yourself as a person of talent, a person who can tap into their inherent capacity for excellence. We all have that capacity, but we have to make sure that we understand what it is. What is the talent with which we have been endowed? Now, it's not enough to just see yourself that way. You have to actually become a person of talent. So in session 3, we talked about a proactive strategy that would enable you to rebuild yourself as a person of talent, to become a work in progress in 2 very distinct channels. The first was to be a work in progress in your career field, to ensure that you are always accreting knowledge, expertise, and skills in your particular profession, craft, or trade. But equally as important, we want to make sure that we are also a work in progress in our talent, that we are always nurturing and developing that unique capacity for excellence so that we can bring that talent to work with us, apply it in our career field, and perform at our peak. And finally, in the 4th session, it's not enough to just see yourself as a person of talent. And to become a person of talent, what you want to do is be able to sustain that capability, to stay a person of talent throughout the 25 or 30 or 40 years of your career. And so what we talked about in session 4 was a career fitness system, a regimen of 7 different kinds of activities that will enable you to nurture your capability, your expertise in your career field, and your expertise in your talent so that you are able to compete for your dream job in the job market and hang on to that job in the workplace. So now we come to the final step, and that is to record your success, to create a record of what you've done in steps 1 through 4. Now, to do that, I want to introduce you to a new kind of career document. It doesn't have a fancy name. I just call it a career record. Now, what does that involve? Well, in our culture, we write things down for 2 reasons. First, we write a to-do list to ensure that we get everything done. So a career record is in part a personal to-do list to make sure that you do all of the things necessary to continue the advancement of your career, to ensure that you're pushing it forward on a continuing basis. Managing your career in today's highly dynamic workplace and job market is a lot like riding a bicycle. You can coast for a very short period of time, but if you don't keep pedaling, you're going to topple over and see your career crash. So it's very important to make sure that you've got all the things listed that you need to get done and that you monitor that progress to ensure they get done. The second reason that we write things down in our culture is as a diary to memorialize our success. And this is very important. It would be nice if I could tell you that, every supervisor, every manager that you have throughout your career is going to recognize your career victories, recognize the effort that you've put in, the advancement that you've made. But we all know that managers and supervisors are imperfect human beings, and they don't always recognize the success that we've achieved. So the career record is a way for you to recognize it for yourself, to make sure that you are aware of the progress that you've made. And that's particularly important in today's turbulent environment because you need that reinforcement. You need that foundation of success in order to keep pushing forward. Now, the other record that we keep in step 5 of the Extreme Success methodology is a real-time resume. Your career record is a foundation for that kind of resume. Why is that important? Because the best jobs in today's highly frenetic, ever-changing job market and workplace, the best jobs come and go at warp speed. So a real-time resume also is constructed for 2 reasons. The first is to make sure that you have positioned yourselves optimally in the best possible light as a qualified applicant for a dream job whenever it comes along. You're ready to make sure that you can compete at the top of your game for that job that you'd like to have. And the second is as a personal advertisement to make sure that you get an interview. You've written a successful resume if you get an interview. A resume will never get you a job, but if it does get you an interview, then it has accomplished its purpose. So let's talk about each of those 2 documents in a bit more detail. A career record. Think of a career record as a bank account for your career. One of the dynamics of this extreme job market and workplace that we've had to recognize is that job security no longer exists. I'm not sure it ever really existed, but for sure today it doesn't exist. You can be doing a terrific job for your employer. You can be the most dedicated and loyal employee ever and still find yourself out on the bricks looking for a job. So the best we can do is not job security, but it is career security. And career security is even better because career security is something that you create for yourself. It's not something you have to rely on an employer for. Career security is something that you achieve. Career security is the ability always to be employed and always by an employer of your choice. The career record helps you build that career security. How? Well, in 2 ways. First of all, as you build up your account in your career record, your summary of your career victories, the skills that you've added through formal academic programs and through your experience on the job, the wisdom you've acquired through your experience and your interaction with mentors, and the accomplishments that you've achieved. As all of that kind of advancement is recorded in your career record, you have more potential qualifications for an employer. You have everything that you need all in one place so that you can then leverage that bank account, if you will, and be in the best competitive position for the job that you want. The second reason that this ongoing record is helpful to you is it enables you to visualize what's missing. As you look at the career record and see what advancements you've made, you can better understand, you can better visualize what it is that you still need to acquire, what skills and expertise you still need to have in order to make sure that there are no gaps in your qualifications. Now, unlike what we have done traditionally with a resume, a career record is developed in near real time. In other words, it is a contemporaneous record. It's something that you do on an ongoing basis. And the reason that you keep it on a contemporaneous basis is because it's really a tool for managing your own career. And you may recall that in our last session, I said that the key to extreme success is to not only be an expert in your profession, craft, or trade, it is also to be an expert in career self-management, to make sure that you know how to keep your career moving forward. So this is a document that helps you become a career activist, someone who is in charge of their career, the master of those changes in the workplace and the job market rather than your victim. How does that work? Well, first, you use that career record to conduct a personal quarterly review. Now, good employers don't conduct just an annual performance appraisal. They give you quarterly reviews so that you can make sure that you can do mid-course corrections if you're off the mark for what your employer thinks is important, and that you can ensure that you keep moving forward in terms of their plans for your ongoing development. Well, this is a review that you conduct for yourself. And you want to take a look at two different things. The first is you want to make sure that you understand what your goals are. As you may recall, back in session 3, we talked about the 3 goals that you need to have in today's ever-changing job market and workplace in order to ensure that you are steadily moving forward. The first is an achievement goal. What are you going to accomplish in the next 12 to 18 months in the job you have now? The second is an advancement goal. What are you going to achieve in order to, or what are you going to do in order to prepare yourself for the job you want to have in 3 to 5 years? The research indicates that most of us are going to be changing jobs every 4 or 5 years. The half-life of your tenure in your job is now down to about 2 years. So you always need to be thinking about not only optimizing your performance in your current job, but getting yourself ready for your next job, which leads to the third goal, which is a developmental goal. What skills and knowledge, what understanding, what insights, what wisdom do you need to acquire in order to get from where you are now to your midterm goal, your achievement goal, and your longer-term goal, your advancement goal? So once you understand your goals, then you can give yourself a review. Now, this is not an appraisal. This is not finding whether you were good or bad or whether you did the right things or the wrong things. This is a review. You're trying to understand whether you made progress towards each of those 3 goals. You set those goals out there, and in the last 3 months, did you actually move towards the accomplishment of those goals? If so, it's important that you recognize that forward progress and you take pride in what you've accomplished. You need to feel good about what you are doing for yourself, the career security that you're building for yourself and your family. You need to take a moment in the quiet of the day, turn off your PDA, turn off the computer, turn off any other external connection that you have with the rest of the world, and think about what it is that you have accomplished over the past 90 days. On the other hand, if you look at your goals and you compare where you are at the end of that 90-day period and you've fallen behind, you haven't made the progress that you should have made, or you've gotten off track, then's the time to look at what kind of remediation is necessary, what kind of steps do you need to take to get yourself back on plan, focused on achieving those goals, so that you ensure that your career is always moving forward. But that's only half of how your record can help you. Because as you probably have heard, as you've listened to people talk about how to find a job in today's job market, your brand is incredibly important. No matter what resume you submit, almost 80% of all recruiters are going to go on the web and take a look at whatever information they can find about who you are, what you stand for as a working person in the world of work. So your career record and your personal quarterly review enable you to update your brand on the web on an ongoing basis. So you don't wait until you unfortunately get laid off or the pink slip comes in the door and you find yourself in the job market and all of a sudden you have to create a brand on the web, or your brand on the web is 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out of date. Instead, you're keeping that brand up to date all of the time. For example, 80% of the profiles on LinkedIn are incomplete. So this personal quarterly review is a way of reminding yourself of the skills, the knowledge, the wisdom, the insights, the capabilities that you have acquired over the past 90 days, and to go to LinkedIn and to add that information to your profile there and to any other profile or resume that you may have archived on the web, so that your brand in the broader world of work is as up to date as you can make it. Second, it's also important to let people in your workplace know about the progress you are making. Now obviously it all depends on how you do this. This isn't a matter of beating your chest and promoting yourself as someone who's better than everybody else in the workplace. But it is important to let your boss know that you have acquired new expertise, you have acquired new capabilities, you have acquired new credentials, because if they don't know that, they can't consider you for more interesting assignments, more challenging work, and advanced positions. That's especially important because, as I indicated in the last session, 50% of all open jobs in the workplace today are being filled by internal candidates. So if you want to make sure that you're considered for the very best opportunities that come up in your current organization, you need to make sure that your boss, your supervisor, understands that you are acquiring skills and knowledge on an ongoing basis. But it's not enough to just let people know that you can do more. It's important that you bring that new expertise, you bring that new capability to work with you, and you apply it on the job, that you actually provide a greater return on investment to your employer through your enhanced capabilities. Now the career record is also the foundation for a real-time resume, because it enables you to avoid having to start a resume from a dead stop. You have everything that you need to write a world-class resume, to make sure that you don't overlook anything, that you don't leave anything out, that you don't minimize something that really deserves more attention. So let's talk a little bit about how that will unfold. Now, as you I'm sure have heard, people have been proposing a replacement for resumes for years. Resumes are imperfect documents, to be sure, but they are still the lingua franca for recruiters and hiring managers. What I want to talk about today is a strategy for using your resume differently so that it has a greater impact. Now, we talked about this strategy in the last session, but I think it's important to go over it again, because it is really the key, if you're in transition, to making sure that you get the consideration that you deserve from employers. You don't send that resume off and it goes into the black hole and you never hear anything back. First of all, you have to do some preparation. And this is, what I'm about to say is hard to accept, but it is true. You want to focus on openings that meet two criteria. The first is you are a perfect fit for them, not a 70% fit or an 80% fit or even a 90% fit. You are a perfect fit for those openings. You exactly match the requirements and responsibilities specified for the opening. Why is that? The reason for that is that most recruiters are not an expert in your field. They may be recruiting for engineers, or they may be recruiting for treasurers, or they may be recruiting for vice presidents of finance, but they are not experts in each of those areas. They are recruiters. So they turn to the hiring manager who specifies the requirements and responsibilities for the job. And in today's highly turbulent environment, it is a huge risk for them to recommend somebody to the hiring manager, their customer, who doesn't exactly fit the profile. They have no basis for making that kind of recommendation. They don't have the expertise to do so, and as a consequence, they don't. So in essence, you're basically wasting your time that you could better spend looking for a position where you are a perfect match if you spend the time to apply for a job where you aren't. But equally as important, you want to make sure that the employer is a perfect fit for you. You want to make sure that its culture and values match your personality and values so that not only are you going to have the right skills to do the job, but you're going to feel comfortable in the environment and be able to perform at your peak. Once you've got that kind of preparation, that kind of research out of the way, you can then practice what I call the application two-step. When you find an opening posted on a job board like BrokerHunter and you decide that you are a perfect match and this employer is a perfect match for you, step one is a test. It's a test in two parts. The first is that you are going to never ever submit a generic resume. You're going to take that career record that you've got and you're going to pick and choose all of that information that you've got from all of that information that you've got listed there, the key and most salient factors that will enable you to look like a dream candidate to that employer. You're going to tailor that resume for the specific requirements stated in the job posting. Why? Because that sends a signal to the employer, to the recruiter, that you care enough to have written a resume that is unique and special for them. The second part is a little less dramatic. It's a little bit more mechanical, but it's equally as important. And that is, did you pay attention in Mrs. Murphy's kindergarten class? That's where you learn how to follow instructions. And the recruiter wants you to follow the instructions in the job posting precisely. So if it says attach your resume and send it via email to the employer, don't embed the resume in the body of the email, attach it. If it says to embed it, don't attach it, and so forth and so on. Follow directions. That step means that you will, when you submit your resume, you will be recognized as a genuine candidate by the HR department. They will have a record of your having submitted the resume. Now, I know that a lot of people feel that employers today never ever acknowledge the receipt of a resume. It's like sending it into a black hole. I work with a lot of employers as the managing director of the International Association of Employment Websites. And I believe that at least 80% of all employers do actually acknowledge the receipt of the resume and show you the courtesy of thanking you for submission. It's an autoresponder. Nobody is sitting there at their little computer sending these messages out individually. The computer itself recognizes the receipt of the resume and turns around and sends you an automatic message so that at least you know the resume was received. The problem is that almost half of those messages get caught in spam filters, so you never see them. But in any case, the fact that you have submitted your resume is important, because step two in the application two-step is to begin the networking best practices that we talked about in the last session, so that you find somebody in the organization whom you know or with whom you have an affinity who is willing to take your resume into the HR department and lay it on the desk of the recruiter filling that opening. Why? Because recruiters have a bias. They believe the best candidates are referred by their coworkers. So your resume goes from being down in the middle of the stack, where there is some probability it will never be seen, to almost the top of the stack, if not the very top of the stack, because it has been referred by a fellow employee. Now, the key here is that you do not want that process of having somebody walk your resume in the door look like you've gone around the HR department, that you've tried to connect with the hiring manager and avoid the recruiter. So step one is important because it says to the HR department, you played by the rules, you followed instructions, you did send your resume to the HR department, and now, even better, someone has come into the HR department and recommended you and handed in your resume again. That's when you really begin to get the consideration that you deserve from the recruiter for the opening to which you've applied. Now, the next step is, again, to position yourself as an asset, as a person of talent. And Here, although the resume is a problematic document, we can improve on it to overcome its single most glaring deficiency. Its single most glaring deficiency is that historically it hasn't revealed anything about your character and your values. Yes, it talks about your skills, and yes, it talks about your experience, and yes, it talks about your education. All of these things are important. But what really differentiates someone from the herd is their character and their values. So this resume format that I'm about to describe, I call the SMART resume. Now, probably you've already been told by other folks in the career area that you don't want to take up the valuable real estate on your resume with an objective statement. You know, I'm looking for a job as a financial services professional in a fast-growing firm. The recruiter already knows that. They know you want a job. You're just wasting space. What you want to put at the top of your resume is a summary. Now, historically, when we've talked about summaries, we've said that these summaries should summarize your key skills for the particular position for which you are applying. I'm going to add two facets to that. I'm going to add talent and knowledge. I want you to begin to build an image in the recruiter's mind that this is a person who sees him or herself as a work in progress. So in addition to skills, you've got the knowledge that you've acquired and the expression of your talent on the job summarized there. And I'm going to give you an example of that in just a moment. Secondly, I want you to add a new section to each of the descriptions of your previous work experience. You know, in the experience section, we tell you put your job title, describe what you did in that previous job, and then have a section usually with bullets which indicate your accomplishments in that particular job. Well, now I want you to add a second subsection called What I Learned. In other words, what wisdom did you acquire? What insight did you gain that you can now bring to an employer? This, again, positions you as a work in progress. It says something about your character and your values. It says that you recognize that the world of work is always changing. In this new workplace and job market, nothing stays the same. And you take personal responsibility for adapting, for staying up to speed, for staying at the state of the art in your profession, craft, or trade. And finally, to the education section, in addition to listing all the degrees and all of the certificates that you have acquired, it's incredibly important that you show an employer that you're still learning, even though you are in transition. Now, I know that a lot of career counselors will tell you that looking for a job is a full-time job. I'm here to tell you that it is a full-time job, but now you have to have a second job. You have to be engaged in some sort of learning or developmental activity even while you're looking for a job, and that needs to be recorded on your resume. You might say, for example, Bronx Community College, Introduction to Business Spanish, ongoing. Again, that single entry conveys to an employer that you recognize the world of work is changing and you take personal responsibility for keeping up. That kind of expression of your character and values is like catnip for employers. It says you are a different kind of person in the world of work. You're not only an expert in your field, but you will continue to be an expert as you are employed with that organization. So, examples. Well, these are imperfect, but I think they will give you the idea. Your summary is a series of words and phrases separated by bullets that might run as many or as few as 10, but certainly no more than 30 individual entries, which describe your skills, your knowledge, and your talent. If your talent is leadership, make sure that you express it. Small team leadership. If your skill is management, make sure that you express it. Major account management. If you have acquired new skills, learned and used best practices for expanding sales in current accounts, you want to make sure that you express it. If you've got some accomplishments that are significant for the particular position for which you are applying, they should go there as well. Top 5% sales award in 2012. Again, in the experience section, in addition to describing the job the way you always had, you tell the organization, you tell the recruiter what you did, and you indicate how well you did it by listing your accomplishments. But again, you want to list a new section that indicates what you learned. In the last job, I learned how to select the optimum customer relationship management system. You know, that's an area of expertise. That's a new capability that I can bring to you, Mr. Employer, as a new employee. Or you might even emphasize the fact that you took some formal coursework in a study or in a particular area by saying, I learned how best to apply my coursework in sales psychology on the job. So you're not just taking courses for the pleasure of taking courses. You are also taking that new knowledge, or you have taken that new knowledge and applied it on the job, and that new expertise you can bring to an employer. Now let's talk about the reality of making sure that your resume actually lands where it needs to land in order for you to be considered a viable candidate. Every single major employer and a growing number of mid-size employers and even many small-size employers now use applicant tracking systems to manage resumes. These are computerized systems which accept resumes, put them into a database where they can be searched by recruiters, and keep track of all of the interactions that a recruiter has had with each of the candidates. So if you have a paper resume and you decide to send your resume into a company the old-fashioned way, or if you go to a career fair and you hand in a paper resume in a career fair, or if you're networking with someone at the local meeting of your professional society or association and you hand them a copy of your resume, when that resume gets back to the HR department, in most cases, it's going to be scanned into the applicant tracking system. So when you have a paper resume, it's important that it be scanner friendly. And that means that unlike the good old days when we tried to create a resume that would stand out from the stack, you know, you used colored paper or colored ink or you tied a shoe to it. Today what you want is the highest possible contrast between the letters on your resume, the writing, and the background, the paper. So don't use colored inks or paper. Use the whitest paper you can find and the darkest black ink that you can find to get that high contrast. Because while scanning technology has dramatically improved over the past 5 years, in many cases, most HR departments, which are at the end of the line in terms of getting new systems, getting new technology, they're still using scanners from 2003 and 2004. So those scanners aren't all that good. Secondly, don't use fancy fonts. Don't use things like Old English. Don't try to impress or make your resume more visually appealing by using some sort of non-standard font. And finally, you want to avoid using fonts with serifs. Serifs are the little horizontal lines at the bottom of vertical lines in fonts like Times New Roman. If you look at the T here in Times, the vertical line that comes down from the top of the T ends in a serif, a little horizontal line. And unfortunately, those horizontal lines often confuse scanners. The lines kind of run together along the bottom of the words, and the scanner will read your expertise as being something like Schumacher instead of sales knowledge. So it's really important that you not use serifs. You also want to make sure that your resume is recruiter friendly. You know, back in the good old days, we used to tell people in transition that the average resume got somewhere between 30 and 45 seconds of review. Today, it's probably even less than that. Not because recruiters don't want to give you the consideration that you deserve, but because organizations are so hard-pressed by the competition that they face in the global marketplace that they've downsized the recruiting team to the point where each individual recruiter is handling 30 or 40 or 50 open recs. And for many of those recs, they are receiving dozens, sometimes hundreds of resumes. So you want to be sure that you lead with your strength. You want to put the very best summary of your skills, your knowledge, and your talent right up front, where even in 5 seconds, a recruiter can get a sense of what it is that is special and unique about you and your credentials and get you into the pile for consideration. You also want to make sure that your resume is keyword rich. Now, I am not a proponent of the technique that some will teach you about putting all kinds of keywords in the white space of your resume and then making the font white or clear so that it doesn't show up, but it would be read by the computer in a database search. I think it's better to make sure that your text is rich with the keywords that represent the kind of vocabulary each organization is using to describe its opening. In other words, instead of using your vocabulary to describe your expertise, look at the vocabulary used in the job posting itself and on the corporate career site about the culture and values of the organization. And as long as you have that expertise, as long as it is a true representation of your personality and skills, use their vocabulary rather than yours. And finally, you know, the key here is to make sure that you are extraordinarily clear and succinct in the description of your core values, core expertise, and talent. Now, how can you heighten the impact? Well, pretty simple. Be attentive to details. You know, I can't tell you how many resumes are discarded, let alone not considered, simply because they are rife with spelling errors and grammatical errors. It should go without saying, but let me just emphasize it again. You also need to be truthful about everything that you put in your resume. Unfortunately today, recruiters have a bias. They believe that upwards of 50, 60, 70% of all resumes have some form of a misstatement or untruth in them. And to protect themselves, they are becoming much, much more vigilant about checking what is stated in a resume, particularly as they get to the finalists, the final 3 or 4 people being considered for a position. So it's very important that you be truthful from the outset so that when that checking occurs, what they find out and what's on your resume is an exact match. The other thing that you can do is to make sure that you don't try to make this a one-person effort in writing the resume. You know, look for people to give you some feedback. So find someone whom you trust, someone whom you think is an unbiased reader, and ask them to read your resume and tell you whether the description of your skills and knowledge, your experience, your education, your summary is clear and impactful. And does it do true justice to what you bring to the table as a prospective candidate? Now, even though a lot of resumes get transmitted over the web, I think it's important to acknowledge that oftentimes those documents can be accompanied by other forms of communication. And it's very important to remember, even though we live in a much less formal culture than historically we have in the past, that every email message with a recruiter or a hiring manager for that matter is a business communication. So you are not E.E. Cummings in these kinds of communications, for example. You don't write in all lowercase letters. You use initial caps where you're supposed to use initial caps. You write in whole sentences, and you try to be as intelligent sounding and as professional sounding in your cover message, your email message, as you are in your resume. Secondly, cover letters, cover messages, if you will, are okay with resumes. They will typically be accepted and stored in an applicant tracking system, but you need to keep them short and tailored. They should be extraordinarily focused on the specifics of the job for which you are applying. So this is not the time to be James Michener and write a 400-page novel. This is the time to have thought enough about what unique capacity for excellence you bring to an opening that you can succinctly and impactfully describe it in a short 2 or 3 sentence cover message. And finally, you want to make sure that you pay attention to details. You know, I do a lot of public speaking, and to make this point, I often ask somebody to come up and join me at the front of the room where I'm speaking. Now, I'm short and bald and in not very good shape, so I always pick someone who's tall and got a whole head of hair and is very athletic looking. And I ask the audience to describe the differences between the two of us. And we all get a big yuck out of, you know, how this guy is obviously so well put together and I'm not. But after he returns to his seat, I point out to the audience that the Human Genome Project proved that that individual and I are only 3% different. In other words, very, very small differences have a huge impact on the way we are perceived by others. And that's especially true in the job market. Very, very small differences, like the email address that you use, can have a huge difference on the way you are perceived by a recruiter and employer. So pay attention to the small stuff so that it doesn't trip you up. Okay. Now, it seems to me at the end of this 5-part series, it would be an appropriate question to ask, has all of this just been a matter of semantics? Is what we're seeing today really the same old job market, only harder, and the same old workplace, only harder? And I've just described these two very similar kinds of environments in a different way. Well, if you take anything away from this series, please make sure that it's this. What's happening today is a cultural and societal shift that is every bit as great, every bit as impactful as the shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy in this country at the end of the 19th century. The come-as-you-are job market is gone and gone forever. You can no longer look for a new job with the skills that you had in your old job. You have to do more. The once and you're done approach to managing your career, paying attention to your career one time a year when you get your annual performance appraisal, is no longer enough to ensure that your career will keep moving forward towards the kind of success that you deserve. This is a much more demanding, a much more difficult environment, but it's also one filled with more opportunity, more upward mobility, more chances for success than anything you've ever seen or experienced thus far in your career. And what I've tried to do over the past 5 sessions is to give you an understanding, an outlook, a strategy, a program, and a record that will enable you to achieve extreme success in this environment. And I wish you the very, very best of luck as you go forward. If you want to know more about anything that I've talked about during the series, it's all contained in my books. I've described them multiple times, so I'm not going to go through and describe them again. They're all available at Amazon.com. And if you'd like to get my free newsletter for job seekers, and or my free newsletter for career activists, just head on over to my website at weddles.com and you can sign up right there on the home page. So I'm going to turn the program back over to David, and we'll see if we have any questions.
Peter?
Yes.
Oh, hey, okay. I'm sorry, I was muted. I wanted to ask, we did have quite a few questions coming in here, and wanted to ask, well, here's a basic one here, but we actually had a couple people ask this, is what font do you suggest when you're writing resume? What do you think is the best kind of a standard font to use?
I think Arial is probably a good font for today's resumes.
Okay, yeah, that seems
and no smaller than 11 points. Again, to make sure that the scanner can read it accurately.
Okay. Do you suggest, or do you think it matters as much to try to keep your resume on one page, if at all possible, or is a multiple-page format okay?
I think a resume, a two-page resume is just fine.
Okay.
Longer than that, I think, is problematic unless you're in academia. But again, because your resume is going to be scanned, and the technology in many HR departments isn't at the state of the art, printing your resume on the front and back of a single resume, of a single piece of paper, making that your two-page resume, can be problematic because you're relying on the fact that the administrative assistant in the HR department is going to run the scanner through to record the first page of your resume, the top of that sheet of paper, and then remember to go back into the stack, pull it out, and run it through again for the back page of your resume. Oftentimes that doesn't happen, and I have looked at a lot of resumes and a lot of employers' resume databases, which are only one of the 2 pages that were submitted for just that reason.
And you had touched upon the applicant tracking systems. Would you say almost in every case, especially I guess with larger employers, that a person's resume almost always is going into some kind of an applicant tracking system? And
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And there's, it's highly likely that they don't even archive a print copy of the resumes anymore. So while you, certainly, don't want to be all keyword based, it's very important, in that 2 pages to highlight and, your skills succinctly, but also directly so that they're picked up. In most of the resume, the ATSs, are they Boolean search-based, Peter, where the recruiter's going in, they're typing in keywords and pulling from the database?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So keep that in mind as they're writing them. Is there any tips there? I've had somebody ask here. There's a resume. Okay, right here. There's somebody asked, is there any thoughts on a guerrilla resume format that says is outlined kind of by David Perry and Kevin Donlin? I'm not familiar with that book, I guess, but you perhaps.
I know David, and I've seen his book. I think that, and I don't mean this as a criticism at all. I think that most recruiters are relatively conservative. At least in the review of candidate credentials, and because they're under such intense time pressure, they want things to be in a relatively standard format so that they can move as quickly and productively as possible. So while I understand the power of video resumes, and I understand the power of being able to do infographics with resumes and so forth, as other organizations have suggested, at the end of the day, for a harried recruiter, a resume that achieves its impact by virtue of the words that are used and the information that is conveyed in a standard format is, in my opinion, more likely to sway the day.
Yeah, I concur with that. I think that most folks out there, need to recognize the fact just of how overloaded these recruiting departments are, that they do have 40, 50, individual jobs that each recruiter is perhaps working on in a big organization, that there just really isn't enough time in the day to probably go through as thoroughly a resume, unfortunately, as they probably should. So it's very, very important to implement these tips and techniques in the format of the resume to make sure that everything is where it should be for the recruiter to take a look at it. Okay, couple more things here real quick. Okay, one question here from an audience member is, if you're already 14 months into your job search and have not taken any courses or education yet, how do you handle that when you get an interview and you're kind of looking at a real big time gap there? I think you had addressed this in an earlier session about time gaps and kind of how to handle that. Do you have anything specific here for this person?
Well, I would take a look at anything and everything that you've done during that gap to see if there was any activity that you performed that could be construed as developmental. For example, if during that 14-month period you networked with your peers on the website of your professional society. Now, the purpose may have been to try to connect with people who could connect you to openings, but if you spent some time talking about the issues, the topics, the subject matter of your profession, craft, or trade, then you might be able to at least indicate that the gap wasn't a complete gap. Maybe you didn't, you weren't as aggressive or proactive as you might have been, but it isn't a complete and total empty space, that there were some things that you did. If you spent some time volunteering during your job search for an organization, did you demonstrate some skills, some knowledge, some expertise that again could help to make that gap seem a little less broad than it might otherwise?
And probably another thing is, unless is in this particular case, is probably don't let a whole bunch more months go by where you're not actively involved in trying to. I think you may have had a period of time there where you're just looking for a job, but now may be time to pursue that additional education or get involved in something to. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Peter, but kind of managing that in between job period there. And you'd indicated before in previous sessions, treating this like a full-time job and. Including furthering your education and any other tips in that respect.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I would immediately enroll in some form of developmental activity. I think with a 14-month gap, it might be important to make it a more formal courseware kind of situation. And then I would, in an interview, be right up front and say, hey, listen, I treated my job search as a full-time job for 14 months. At the end of 14 months, I realized that my skills were beginning to degrade. My knowledge was falling a little bit behind the state of the art. So I proactively enrolled in a course to make sure that I got myself back up to speed. That's reflected on my resume, and it says something about my character, my values, that I'm determined to be at the leading edge in my field.
Yeah, that's a great point there. I think that's definitely good advice there. Another thing about resume length, it said somebody here has a resume that goes beyond 2 pages. They've been in the business over 15 years, and they've gotten some feedback that if they try to condense it shorter than 2 pages, it seems like they're maybe getting a little bit light on their experience.
I acknowledge that the longer you've been in the workplace, the harder it is to get on to 2 pages. But I think the key word here is tailoring. I suspect that not every situation, not every activity, not every job that you had was important to each of the openings for which you were applying as other aspects of your career. So I'd use the idea of sharpening the focus of your resume for each job for which you apply to help perhaps maybe not eliminate, but certainly to use less space, fewer words to describe those things that aren't quite as relevant.
Okay. Okay. We've had this come up certainly before. Had some questions here on age discrimination. The person here feels like that they are, in a situation several times where they've kind of felt like that's the case, that they're in their mid-50s, and that perhaps they felt like that was kind of going on. I think you had touched upon that as well. That
it is a terrible affliction, and it is alive and well, unfortunately, in the workplace. Two things. One, I think organizations where age bias occurs in the recruiting process tells you something about the culture and values of the organization. I believe that the recruiting process is a good way for you to test drive an employer. The way you're treated as a candidate is a good indication of how you're going to be treated as an employee. So if you bump into that kind of situation, I know it's frustrating, I know it is horribly debilitating, but it also tells you that might not be an organization where you do want to be employed. Having said that, the best way to overcome gaps in a resume, the best way to overcome not being a perfect match for a position, and the single best way to overcome age and even gender bias and other kinds of biases is that application two-step. It is to, yes, submit your resume, but at the same time begin looking for those connections that can give you the kind of human support, the kind of employee referral affirmation that will fly in the face of those kinds of factors and help you overcome them.
Yeah, Peter, I think that's a great answer. I think what happens in a lot of cases with age bias is, it may not perhaps be exclusively age bias, but perhaps a perception that a person that once they reach a certain stage in their career is no longer willing to learn and or is no longer teachable. And I think that's probably what a lot of age bias is that, well, we can't train that person, or we're not going to invest the time because they've had 30 years and, you're not going to teach them anything.
Well, that's why the SMART resume is so important, because it establishes you as a work in progress. Yes. And confronts that bias head on.
Absolutely, and I think that's where a resume too. Going back and you're talking about focusing on something that happened, or maybe a part of your career 30 years ago. I think what you really want to do is show that progression, that advancement of knowledge, that you're carrying this forward, and that you are a work in progress. And I think that's a great way to overcome that. And that's certainly probably the best way to do that. Let's see here. Okay. It says, how do you handle when you've worked at an employer for years and you're now wanting to, just change careers, and you want to, for no other reason, you just want to change the scenery. It may be a lateral move. It may be, that you've kind of reached your potential at a particular employer and you're ready to get a change of scenery, so to speak.
Well, I think that is the perfect description of today's workplace. We no longer have a career ladder. In 99.9% of all organizations, that form of sort of very structured way forward, a single pathway in your career is gone. And what you now have is a career jungle gym. And if you'll recall what it was like on those jungle gyms, sometimes you moved sideways and sometimes you even took a step back or two. But the key to feeling like you were making progress on the jungle gym was to always keep your objective in mind. If you always knew where you wanted to get, then moving sideways or even backwards didn't seem like that you were moving off track or even a failure. It just simply meant that you were better positioning yourself to get to that goal. And I think that if you take that perspective, you know, and if it's time for you to move on to another employer, and that's how you're going to continue to advance in your field, then more power to you. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Peter, any particular sectors, as somebody's asking, that you see from your perspective, you know, over the next 5 years that you think are poised to be the best opportunity for somebody? You know, healthcare, finance, insurance. I guess, do you have any?
Well, I unfortunately, you know, I track these things fairly closely, and the jobs that we're going to have 10 years from now, in many cases, haven't even been invented yet. I mean, that's how fast things are moving. Right now, you know, IT in the healthcare space is a very, very hot area because of the electronic conversion of healthcare records. They just simply cannot find enough employees. You can almost write your own ticket in that field. But eventually, you know, those records are all going to be transferred from paper to electronic format, and that field is not going to be as robust as others that we probably don't even know of at this point.
Right.
But healthcare is obviously big for all the reasons that we all know. And I also think that anything having to do with engineering, having to do with technology is probably a good area. But you know what? In almost every field, I mean, there are 3.5 million jobs open in the U.S. right now, and they cut across virtually every sector of the economy. Everything from manufacturing to, you know, space tourism. There are all kinds of jobs opening. And if you put 100 CEOs in a room and you ask them, what is the single most important thing that you'd like to see in candidates today that you aren't seeing, they would say creativity, innovation, imagination, the ability to take whatever skill you have and apply it on the job in a way that enhances productivity, improves quality, helps an organization compete successfully in the global marketplace. So if you can, and I think that's the description of a person of talent. That is someone who brings their capacity for excellence to work. And if you can position yourself that way, you can work in almost any field and achieve career security.
I was thinking of a funny analogy for that, Peter, after the very first session here, and you'll see from time to time, and you know, for those of you that are not college football fans, this will probably be lost on you, but a lot of times in the recruiting process, they will recruit people as athletes and with no particular position attached. And what they're doing in that case is they're saying this person is so good of an athlete that we're just, quote unquote, a person of talent, that we're going to put them on the team. We don't know where we're going to put them yet. We just know we want them. And I think the same thing's happening here. As you'd indicated, that there's a lot of jobs that are going to be created over the next 5 or 10 years in industries. You know, the technology's been so disruptive. We've seen it firsthand in the business we're in. We don't know necessarily in 5 to 10 years exactly where the puck's going to be. But we do know that the ability to adjust and to be that talent's always going to be in short supply. And being able to you know, leverage that in following Peter's advice here of thinking yourself in terms of, you know, not boxing yourself into a role or particular, even an industry, so to speak, but you know, you're a multifaceted, talented person that can do a lot of things well, and you know, kind of lead with that as it applies to particular job openings is probably the way going forward. Any other things to add to that, Peter, as far as just kind of somebody mentally making a shift there as far as how they think of themselves?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right, David. I think that you know, that the word talent is misunderstood in our culture, and if we can get our arms around what it is that is our talent and make sure that that talent is expressed in whatever career field and whatever industry we're working in, we'll do just fine, regardless of what area of work that we're in. And the wonderful thing, is that every single one of you, every single one of your spouses, every single one of your kids, every single one of your parents, all of you are people of talent. You were born with that capacity for excellence. It's like an opposable thumb. It is an attribute that defines being human. So if you can just take the time and make the effort to explore deep down inside what it is that unique gift, and make sure that it's always being nurtured and developed, as well as acquiring the skills in your profession, that you do both of those things. I think that extreme success understates the opportunity that you have in the world of work in the 21st century.
That's great. That's great. Well, folks, we have some more questions coming in here, but I think we are short on time here. We've ran over quite a little bit here. So what we will do is, for those of you that have additional questions that we didn't answer, Peter or Charlene will be getting back with you, and we'll do our best to answer that. We will be, somebody did ask a question, we will be putting an archive of every one of these presentations up in multiple formats. You'll get an email with all 5 of these that you can go back and view. We're going to put them up on Peter's YouTube page, as well as the BrokerHunter YouTube page as well, for you to go back and review as needed. I would like to thank Peter. This is a huge commitment of your time, and this has been a wonderful thing to offer out to our talent community, Peter. We thank you so much for doing this, and you can't say much about how much we value you being able to come and talk to our people.
It's been my pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely great. Folks, this webinar has been recorded again, and we're going to be sending out an email shortly with all the next step links and everything. I would like to thank our corporate sponsor, Allstate, as well. They are an employer that has multiple opportunities. We certainly will send out a link to that as well in an email for you to possibly take a look at them and keep them in consideration as well for bringing this series to you. We will also be bringing more learning series to you all in the future, and so keep an eye out for those. Hopefully we'll have some here in the next couple of months here that provide value to you. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their time, and this concludes today's webinar. Goodbye.